Welcome to Make a Memory Bear. Today we're making Jack, the memory dog, and the link for this exact pattern is available in the description box below. If you click on that link, it'll take you over to my Etsy shop where you can purchase the pattern, and Etsy will immediately send it to you in an email so that you can download it and print it and get started right away. And that is step number 1. Let's talk about the supplies you'll need. First, you're going to want to pick up some safety eyes and a nose. For eyes, I get 15 millimeters. For nose, you can go anywhere from 20 to 26 millimeters. Here's an example of a dog with a 20 millimeter nose. And here's the 26 millimeter nose. This is important if you're giving this to a child or if it'll be near a child. It has to be safety eyes and nose. We also want to get a 16-ounce bag of stuffing, the kind that's made for stuffed animals. You'll need scissors, matching thread, a sewing needle, some pins, and then a seam ripper is optional but recommended. And I have only ever made these patterns by sewing machine, but I'm sure hand sewing will work too. You'll need just under 1 yard of fabric total. So for today, I'm using 2 shirts to make my dog, but here you can see an example of what it looks like with 2 different fabrics. And here's an example of what it looks like with 3 different fabrics. As long as it measures just under 1 yard total, you're good. Dress shirts like this, like a men's button-up shirt, tend to be my favorite fabric to work with. I also like working with little baby receiving blankets and with flannels. Any type of cotton is best. If you are a beginner, I am going to highly recommend that you choose some sort of fabric that is solid, like this solid blue one I've got here. Stripes and plaids are going to be harder to line those up. Also, it's easiest if you find a shirt that is the same on the inside and the outside. If you see this one, there's a clear right side and wrong side. That's going to be a little bit more challenging if you're brand new. So if at all possible, choose a fabric more like this blue shirt that's the same on the inside and the out. It won't be as confusing, less room for error. If you do have a fabric that is like this little baby's onesie, these little sleepers, these are super stretchy. Or if you have an old t-shirt or an old sweatshirt that just has a lot of stretch to it, I highly recommend that you get an iron-on stabilizer, which is something you iron onto the fabric first, and that's going to give it a lot more stiffness and sturdiness before you start sewing. We're ready to get started, so go ahead and cut out all of your pattern pieces on the solid line. If you're using multiple fabrics, you need to decide which pattern pieces you want cut out of which material. So for example, today I decided to use the lighter purple for the tail and the ears only. The rest of the pattern I'm going to make from the darker purple. So you'll notice each pattern piece tells you how many total pieces you need to cut and how many of those need to be in reverse. Reverse means that some of them need to be cut out with the words facing up, and then you need to flip the pattern piece over and cut that number out with the words facing the opposite way. So for example, if you have a single piece of fabric with a right side and a wrong side like this one, you would take your pattern piece, you'd first cut one out facing this direction, and then you would flip the pattern over and cut it out a second time so that you have 2 total pieces. One is forward, one is reverse. But to save time and to cut down on the number of total cuts you need to make, you can just fold your fabric over on top of itself like this and do a double layer. Then when you cut it out just one time, automatically you'll end up with one facing forward and one being in reverse. So I recommend doubling up all of your fabric before you cut it out. That way you only have to cut out one time for each pattern piece. So because I'm using shirts to make my memory dog, Like I said, I'm going to double up my fabric, and because this fabric is the same on the inside and the outside, there's no real right or wrong front or back to this. I'm just going to lay this shirt out like a normal shirt would be, and then I'm going to start pinning my pattern pieces to the shirt. And there's really no right or wrong way to do this, in my opinion. I just arrange the pattern pieces any way I can. I realize some people are making these patterns out of much smaller shirts than I have here, so just arrange them any way you can and pin them onto the fabric. So for most of these pattern pieces, it says that you need to cut out 2 for each piece. But for the legs, the arms, and the ears, we need to cut out 4. And what you may be tempted to do is fold over your material so that you have 4 layers of fabric like this, and then just cut it out one time, which you can. I don't recommend doing it that way though, because what I find is that it's just too thick and the edges get a little bit wonky. They're not as clean. So I like to cut it out one time, move it to a separate spot, and cut it out a second time. But that's only for the arms, the legs, and the ears. For everything else, we're just going to set it down and we're going to start cutting out our pieces. As I mentioned earlier, if you're using a fabric that is really thin, stretchy, old, delicate, satiny, silky, you may decide that you want an iron-on stabilizer to make it stiffer and so it will hold its shape and it's easier to sew. I'm going to use a stabilizer today to show you how that works. And essentially you're just going to repeat the process that we just did with our fabric. You're going to take your iron-on stabilizer. It has a rough side. That's the part that has the iron-on nubbins on it. It's kind of textured feeling, and then the other side is really smooth. So in this case, the rough side is going to be our right side of the fabric. So we're going to double this up just like we did with our shirt. We're going to fold it over so we have a double layer, and we're repeating this process. We're going to take our pattern pieces, we're going to pin them onto the stabilizer, and then we're going to cut them out. And then cut your pattern pieces out of the stabilizer. To keep myself organized, I like to stack all my pattern pieces on top of each other with my fabric, my stabilizer, and the pattern template, just so I can refer to those quickly as I'm going along and trying to put the dog together. So if you're using a stabilizer, make sure you refer to the directions that come with yours. But what mine says specifically is that you start with a pressing cloth or a real thin piece of fabric and you dampen it first. So that's what I'm doing. I'm just squirting this with some plain old water to dampen my cloth. And then we're going to open up each one of our pattern pieces so that the wrong side of the fabric is facing up, or at least this is how I'm going to do it, because we want to make sure that we're ironing the stabilizer onto the inside of what will become the dog. So we want the wrong side of our fabric facing up, and then we're going to take our stabilizer and we want the rough side that has the glue essentially on it to be touching the fabric. We want the smooth side of the stabilizer facing up towards us. So put your rough side down on your pattern pieces and then put your pressing cloth on top of that. Mine says to use a hot iron on a cotton setting with steam, and so I'm going to press that for about 15 to 30 seconds. And this will be repeated for every single pattern piece. I like to give my pattern pieces a quick once over to make sure that all the corners and edges got sealed completely. And look at how nice and flat and crisp those pieces look now. I love it. You'll notice that there's some little excess or overflap occasionally. That's no big deal. You could go ahead and trim it if you're real perfectionistic, but it honestly doesn't matter because it's all going to be inside of the dog when we're done. So just make sure it's roughly on there. We are finally ready to sew, and we are going to start with the face. And for this particular step, we're going to be separating our fabric into 2 single pieces of fabric. What I like to do is lay them out like this so that the right sides are both facing up and they're looking at each other so that they're mirroring each other. And our first step is that we're going to be working on seam A, which is the mouth of the dog essentially. So what I like to do is just fold the bottom half of the mouth up towards the top of the head, and I line up this little triangle notch. Then I'm going to put a couple of pins in place to hold that seam temporarily together. And then repeat the process for the other half of the face. So just fold it from the bottom up towards the top of the head, line up the triangle notch, put in a couple of pins to hold it in place, and then we'll be just sewing straight across, right across seam A. I wanted to point out that for today's tutorial, I'm using black thread just so you can see it as I'm sewing against this white stabilizer, but you would want to use a thread that matches your fabric so that these stitches will be invisible when we're done. And our next step is we're going to be sewing these 2 halves of the face together. I like to start by pinning right at that mouth seam. I kind of fold those little flaps out of the way and make sure that that seam is nice and lined up because that is going to be making the mouth, so we don't want it to be crooked or off center. But I'm going to stick a bunch of pins in right there and then just all the way around the edge from the neck all the way up to the top of the head. And then we sew all along that edge. Now is probably a good time to let you know that on the day of this tutorial, my sewing machine was a mess. It is in serious need of being serviced and the tension was all off. So you're going to catch some glimpses of the underside of what my sewing looks like, and whew, it's a mess. Just bear with me, it looks cute in the end. And next we're going to be sewing the front of the body just along the seam where it says sew here first. It's the side that has the 2 little triangle notches. And this is such an easy and straightforward seam that I don't even take the time to pin it, but if that would make you feel more comfortable, pin it and then go ahead and sew it. And now we're ready to attach the head to the front of the body. So I open up the body and I'm going to take the head. The top of the head is where these little triangle notches are. So that's the top. And what we're going to be attaching is the bottom of the head. That's the neck essentially. So go down to the opposite end away from the triangle notches. And I start by lining up that center seam that goes down the front of the face and the front of the body. And I'm going to put a couple of pins in right there first. And again, those little flaps, if you were a professional, you would probably take the time to press those open with an iron, but I am not taking that time, so I'm just trying to lay them flat as best I can. Then I'm going to kind of pin them in place. Then I'm going to pin the rest of the neck, and then I will sew along that seam. Let's give it a quick once over. It should be looking something like this, where the body is now attached to the head and those little triangles are up at the top. Next, we'll sew the arms, and we have 4 total arm pieces, and we're going to separate those into 2 distinct arms. We're going to place them so that the right sides of the fabric are together. We're going to sew everywhere except for between these 2 triangle notches, because that's going to leave a hole where we can stuff the arms later. So just sew all the way around the perimeter except for between those triangles. One other disclaimer, in addition to my sewing machine being a hot mess on this day, I also used a new camera stand, and boy oh boy, is it a bumpy ride when I get sewing, so I'm sorry that the footage is so bouncy. And just to give myself a visual reminder not to sew between those notches, I like to put a pin facing the other direction, right there. So I remember, oh yeah, skip over that area so I don't sew between the triangle notches. So throughout the pattern making, anytime we have these really curvy areas, I like to clip them first before turning the pattern piece right side out. That's going to make it lay down flatter and more nicely. So this is one technique that you can use. However, not too long ago, I discovered a different technique, which is where you simply trim that excess away and you cut like right up against the seam, which, you know, if you don't have a steady hand, or if you think you're going to be tempted to cut right through your thread, then don't do this technique. But I have found that it really makes it nice when you turn your pattern pieces right side out. It really does lay so nice and flat without all that bulky excess there. So use whatever technique that you like, but I would either clip it or just trim it down before you turn these arms right side out. And now we're ready to attach the arms to the front of the body. And they go right here on the side between that neck seam and that little triangle notch that's on the body. So line it up with that edge and put a couple of pins in place. Just make sure that you've got it right side up so that the little hand is going towards the belly and it's curving up like that. And then just pin it in place on each side, and then we'll sew that arm into place. Let's just do a quick check-in. Does your little dog look like this? Hopefully. Let's move on to the next step. The ears are next. These are pretty straightforward, a lot like the arms. We have 4 pieces, so we're going to separate those into 2 ears. We're going to place our right sides together. Make sure it's all lined up. We'll put a couple of pins in place, and then we're going to sew around the perimeter. So for the ears, we don't want to sew along that top straight edge, but we do sew all around the curve. And just like the arm, I'm electing to trim off all of this excess, but you could also clip these curved areas. Either way, you want to get it ready to flip it right side out. And we're going to take the ear and attach it to the head where we have those little triangles up at the top. We're going to line the edge up with that, and we're going to pin our ears into place. And then we'll sew right along each edge. We are ready to put the face onto our memory dog, and I highly recommend that you use safety eyes and noses if this is for a child or if a child will be near it. I prefer 15mm eyes, but you can certainly choose ones that are smaller than this, or you can get bigger ones. They also come in different colors, so if you want blue-eyed dog or whatever. For a nose, I'm going to use a 20mm, but I have used as big as 26mm like this one, and I'll show you a couple of pictures so you can decide which you prefer most. So this is the 20mm nose. I think this is the one I use most common, and this is the 26mm, so it's totally your preference. As far as placement goes, you can certainly use the pattern for a rough idea of where to place this, but honestly, I encourage you to stick it wherever you like, the nose and the eyes too, for that matter. But if you want to use the pattern, what I would suggest is just laying the face as flat as you can, like line up that center seam and lay it really flat. Take the pattern, line it back up with that edge, and then you can use this as a rough guide, like, okay, here's approximately where the nose should go. Here's where the eye should go, or just stick it wherever you find it most pleasing. But I do suggest, if you have a seam ripper, to use one to make a little teeny weeny starter hole for the nose and the eyes so that it's easier to stick it through the fabric, especially if you're using a stabilizer like I am. However, I do want to caution you, do not stick the post right in the center of the seam. You need to go off to one side or the other by just a smidgen so that it's actually into the fabric and not in the seam. If you cut that seam, it's likely that your dog's face could unravel over time. So just make a teeny weeny starter hole right next to the seam where you want the nose to go, and then you can more easily stick the post through and pop on that safety back. And once you've got it in place, then you can kind of wiggle the seam so that the nose looks centered and everything looks correct. You won't even be able to tell that it's just slightly off to one side or the other. And then I'll do the same thing for the eyes. I'm going to use that center seam that goes down the middle of the face and lay the fabric as flat as possible. I'm going to take my seam ripper and I'm going to put a tiny little starter hole straight from one side through to the other side and make that little bitty hole. That way I'm certain that my eyes are going to be in the same spot on both sides of that center seam. This is also the point in time where if you want to add any other embellishments such as eyelashes, or if you want to embroider on tongue hanging out, if you want to give it eyebrows, whiskers, anything like that, you would want to put all of those in right now. On to the legs. All right, so just like the arms, we've got 4 pieces. We're going to separate these into 2 separate legs with the right sides of our fabric together. And what we're going to be doing first is the entire outside of the leg, which is down here around this curve. We're going to skip that little V, that's our dart. We're going to skip that. We're going to go underneath, curve all the way around. We're going to skip in between our triangle notches because that's where we're going to stuff it. And then we're going to sew this last little bit right here. So essentially the entire perimeter except for between the triangles and at that little dart at the toe. Okay, so now that we sewed the entire perimeter and we trimmed off our excess, now we're going to sew that dart, the toe of the bear. And what you need to do is essentially pinch your fabric apart. Easier said than done. Okay, pinch it apart so that we can line up that seam that goes above and below that dart. Again, with these little flaps. You can press them if you're fancy. Otherwise, you're just going to put a bunch of pins right along there and try to flatten out that seam, and then we'll sew straight across that toe. And then we'll go ahead and turn these feet right side out. Now we're ready to attach these legs to the front of the body. And what you're going to want to do is open up that foot so that the seam goes down the center of the leg. Make sure it's nice and flat like that. And then what I do is I flip it so that it is the toe or the foot is facing up towards the neck of the dog. And I don't have any specific indicators, but I'd say like maybe 1/2 inch away from that center seam is where I'm going to start pinning the foot. And then you'll notice that we're working with a straight edge here for the leg, but the body is round. So you're going to have this little tiny bit of excess that kind of hangs over. That's okay. It's going to be on the inside of the dog. So we'll just follow the round curve of the dog's body, and then we're going to repeat with the other leg. So lay it flat. We want the foot facing us, and then we're going to flip it so that now the foot is up by the neck of the dog. Move over from the center seam about maybe half an inch and then pin it into place, just kind of following that curve, but also knowing that a little triangular section is going to stick out when we're done pinning it. When I sew this, I like to sew it kind of face down so that I can see that curve of the body, because that's what I want to follow. So you'll see that it looks like it's inside out to me, and I'm just going to follow the curve instead of the straight edge of the leg. And we're going to sew those into place. So now the front of the body is completely done, and it should look like this. We're ready to move on to the back of the body. We're going to start with the back of the head, and we're going to sew right along seam A. It's another one of those super easy straight seams that I'm not even going to bother pinning it, but we'll just sew right along there. Next up is the tail. We'll place our tail pieces with the right sides together. I am going to pin these into place because it's a little bit of a smaller one, and there's some tight angles here that we're going to have to maneuver around. But once they're pinned, we're going to be sewing the top and then that bottom curve. We don't sew right there where it attaches to the body, that straight line. I do recommend cutting off this excess fabric, especially right at the tip of the tail, because when we turn this inside out, we don't want that to be real bulky and rounded. We want to have a little bit more of a pointed tip. So cut off that excess, and then we're going to turn this right side out. This is a small little pattern piece, so take your time with it. Try not to be too rough with it. I have found that grabbing like a pencil and using the eraser end, or sometimes in your bag of stuffing, they give you like a little wooden dowel, looks like a little chopstick. You can use that to help you push the material out and get more of a pointed tip at the end of the tail. Now we're going to grab a little bit of stuffing, and we're going to stick that into the tail of the dog, again using that pencil to help me get it to the tip up there. And I'm not putting a ton of stuffing in here. You can make it as stiff or as floppy as you like it, but I am making sure that right here where I'm going to be attaching this tail to the dog, that I'm not putting too much stuffing there, because I want that to lay nice and flat so I can get it into my sewing machine okay. So just leave about a thumb's width right there at the opening to the tail. Next, we're going to be working on the back of the body, and again, I'm separating this into two single pieces of fabric. I want them laying out like this so they're kind of mirroring each other, so that that little dart is open opposite directions from each other. And I'm going to fold the bottom up onto that seam. This is just like what we did with the mouth of the dog. So I'll put a couple of pins there to secure it into place, and then I'll be sewing straight along that seam on each individual pattern piece. because this is a step that can trip some people up, I do want to take just a second to make sure yours looks like this, that your little triangle notches right here, the single one is facing it, the double triangles are out to the sides, your fabric is right side up, and you've got that bottom folded up and pinned. If it looks good, let's sew it. So we're ready to attach our back body pieces together, and we're going to be starting with that seam that we just sewed, exactly like we did on the mouth of the dog and the face. We're going to line up that seam first so that we are assured that it's aligned. So start by putting your pins there and trying to get those flaps laid down at the same time. I'm also going to continue pinning below that seam down to the bottom point of the back of the dog's body. So put in a couple underneath the seam. And then we are going to be putting our tail above the seam. So it's going to go right between that triangle and the seam. Right there, we're going to sandwich it between these layers. So it's a little bit bulky, which is why you don't want to have any stuffing right there at the opening of the dog's tail. But do your best to get it sandwiched in between. We want to make sure the tail is pointing up and not going under the dog's bottom. So point it up, and we're going to pin that in place. And the space between those triangle notches, again, is going to be a stuffing hole. So we don't want to put any pins there, and we don't want to sew there, but we do need to pin right at the very top. This is up at the neck of the dog, so we're going to put a couple pins there too, and we're going to go ahead and sew that minus this area between the triangles. I'm going to stick a pin going the opposite direction just to remind me when I've got it at the sewing machine. So sew here, skip here, sew here, all the way down to this bottom edge. Okay, let's give it a quick peek. Let's open it up. Okay, looking good. We have got everything where it should be. We've got our stuffing hole, followed immediately by the tail, and then our seam that makes the little bum. So we are looking good. We're ready to move on to the next step. Next, we're going to attach the back of the head to the back of the body. We're going to start by making sure that the right sides are together. As always, we're going to be starting with the center seam, the one that goes down the middle of the head and the middle of the body. I'm going to lay those flaps down, grab my pins, secure this in place, and then I'll be sewing straight across. Okay, you guys, we are down to the home stretch. This is our last sewing step, but it is a doozy. We're going to be attaching the back of the body to the front of the body, and I always start with the front by tucking in all of these external pieces that I don't want to get caught up in the seam. So I tuck in the ears inside the face, and then I actually even kind of roll up the arms and the legs a little bit so that they can fit inside the belly and they're out of the way so that they won't be caught in my sewing machine when I do this perimeter. So I'm going to lay the back of the body onto the front, and I'm going to start up at the top at that center seam, lay those flaps down flat, and I'm going to put a couple of pins there, and then I go down to the bottom of the dog and I go to that center seam and I put a couple of pins there, and then I go to each side of the neck where the headpiece attaches to the body on both the front and the back of the body, and I'm going to put some pins in at that seam too. Those are my 4 most important areas, so I want to focus on those first, and then the rest of my time I'm just going to be trying to line up the edge of the body and the face and all around the perimeter, just putting as many pins in as I need to in order to make this all lined up. Just take your time and use as many pins as you need. You should end up with something that looks kind of like this when all is said and done, a little bit like a snowman, no arms or legs. I do want to point out that we have those little triangle bits where we attach the legs. Like I said, don't worry about that. We will be sewing those inside of the dog. I do want to point out when I am sewing this, I like to start up at the top, but I like to sew it face up. And the reason why I like to do it this way is because then I can see where I already attached the ears, the arms, the legs, and I can sew right either on top of that seam or right on the inside of it so that it's not visible when we turn this dog inside out when it's all said and done. So just go all the way around the perimeter, again taking your time. These are curves, they're kind of wonky, so just take your time and get around the entire perimeter, and this is going to be our last sewing step. Now we're going to be turning the dog right side out. So go to that stuffing hole in the back and very gently reach inside and start pulling out legs, tail, arm, all the body parts that you can find. And then the last step will be turning the head right side out. But now you can actually see it's a precious little dog that we've got here. And our final step is going to be to stuff it. Now, this again is a very personal preference, but I like to put a ton of stuffing into the face and to the head so that it's really solid and it's structured. And then for the belly, the arms, and the legs, I put less in there so that it's a little bit squishy. But you can make this dog as firm or as floppy as you like. But I like to go head, belly, legs, and then arms last. One other tip that I just remembered is that right where the arms and the legs meet the body, I don't put a ton of stuffing there just because I don't want the arms and legs to stick straight out. I want them to be able to flop with the body. So I don't put as much right up there, but I do put a lot like in the hands and in the feet. doggone it, I lied. I forgot we have another sewing step. It just doesn't involve the sewing machine. We have to sew closed these stuffing holes. So I recommend using a ladder stitch. I'm not very good at a ladder stitch, so I'm going to link a tutorial in the description box below where you can watch a professional show you how to do this. But essentially what we need to do is close up all of the stuffing holes on the legs, the arms, and the back of the dog. And then, I promise, we'll be officially finished. And there you have it, ladies and gents. Jack the Memory Dog is officially complete at this point in time. You could leave it right here and you would have a precious little memory dog. Or you can add some accessories. You could put a bow on its head, a bow around its neck, a dog collar. Now's the time that you'd also want to do any iron-on appliques. So if you want to add a heart or an American flag, if you want to add buttons, any accessories that you'd like to add, now is the time. I encourage you to go crazy with the accessories and just really make this your own. Personalize it to your taste. I hope you love your memory dog as much as I do. Thank you so much for watching.